All right, so we are starting a new series called Ancient Guests. And as you can see, it's a kind of a familiar picture focusing on the couple of different times in the Old Testament where we see an appearance of maybe Jesus Christ. So there's debate among it. But I think that there are times in the Old Testament where Jesus, before he took on human flesh, right? Remember, he came in the virgin birth through Mary. Before that, he still existed. Because remember, Jesus is the second member of the Trinity. He is an eternal God, and he's existed eternally. And so in the Old Testament, he visits us every now and then to give us some type of guidance or comfort in our lives. And so I don't know if you know this, but if you've never really been to a church or explored Christianity, the Bible is full of 66 books written by about 40 different authors over 1,500 years. And about most of this side of the book is the Old Testament. Look how thick that is. And then the rest of the New Testament is not as thick. Oftentimes we spend a little bit too much time in the New Testament. I'm not talking poorly about the New Testament, okay? But I think that there are instances in the Old Testament where we need to find Christ in light of what he has done in the New Testament, okay? So the New Testament is kind of like the lens by which we look back at the Old Testament. And so because we know who Christ is, and he lived for us, he died for us, he resurrected for us, Jesus Christ is amazing, I want to try and find stories in the Old Testament where he appears to us, okay? And so that's what we're going to do in the book of Daniel, chapter 3. This is one of the most well-known passages and well-known stories that happen in the Old Testament, kind of like the big old David and Goliath moment. This is very similar to that. Basically, Daniel the book of Daniel has Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So we're going to read this story. We don't need to stand tonight as it is a lot of reading, okay? So we're going to start in chapter 3, verse 8. This is the word of the Lord. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this manner. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. This story has all the drama in it. It has an antagonist, protagonists, kind of the guys who snitched and told on them that they weren't worshiping this idol. And I feel like in light of to understand what's all happening in this story, we have to know what had just previously happened. And so when you look at the nation of Israel, the Jews, God's chosen people throughout the Old Testament, they had been sieged. The Babylonians, which Nebuchadnezzar was the king of, all right? So think the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, the bad guys, they ransacked Jerusalem. They stole millions of Jews and put them into their own imprisonment and took them out of their own land. And then they destroyed their temple where they had to worship God. They were living under Babylonian captivity for years. And it seemed like there was no hope. It would be as if California decided to take over Nevada and take us all there on purpose. I mean, it would be nice to live in California, don't get me wrong. But they were stolen out of their land, and now Nebuchadnezzar was a tyrant. He was prideful. He was this king that demanded that everybody worship him and this golden image that he had set up. And so what I want to do when it comes to this ancient guest sermon is to show you guys that this message is not just something that happened thousands of years ago that we could be like, wow, cool, that was great. Miraculous things happen in the Bible. But it is something that could clearly affect you and I today. And so I want to re-walk through the text, and then I want to give you a couple of points of application in regards to this text, okay? So there's kind of a couple of different scenes in this story. Basically, in verses 8 through 12, the Chaldeans, they snitch on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because they knew the penalty of not worshiping this idol or worshiping this golden image was death. And they did not like the Jews, okay? The Jews have a very rough history. They've been taken out of their places, taken out of their homes, and held in captivity numerous times. And now they were being forced to worship this golden image. And so Nebuchadnezzar hears of this. He brings them in. He kind of gives them like a trial, right? Instead of just taking the Chaldeans for their word, he says, okay, well, I'm going to talk to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego myself. And I'm going to say, hey, are you really not going to worship this golden image that I have made everybody worship? You see, during this day, there was not a separation between church and state. In America, we have separation of church and state. We have the freedom to worship God, and we should praise the Lord for that because there are different areas in this world right now where you're not allowed to legally, publicly gather and worship the Lord. But in the Babylonian times, whatever the king said went. Whether you were a Babylonian or you were a slave like the Jews during this time, you had to do what the king said. Otherwise, it was no go for you. And so as he's putting them on trial, he says, are you really not going to worship this golden image? They say, no, I don't have to. I worship the one true living God, Yahweh, right? The one who brought us out of the land of Egypt. We worship him. And so they face Nebuchadnezzar head on, and this infuriates him. They boldly refuse to worship this God. They really trust that God will deliver them from this fiery furnace. There's a verse in this story that we're going to reflect on a little bit more in the future. But verse 18, they're basically saying, hey, we trust God will save us. But verse 18 says this, but if not, if God does not choose to save us, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Even if God does not save them, they are committed to not worshiping this false God. What a bold, resilient, uncompromising, unwavering faith. I know we look at them and we're like, I want a faith like that. What a beautiful image of standing on the truth, of standing on there are no other gods before God. We've seen God do many mighty works in the past. We're going to choose to worship him instead of the gods that the king is asking us to worship. And so verses 19 through 23, we see that Nebuchadnezzar gets angry and he heats up the furnace to 7 times hotter than it normally is. And the fire, it gets so hot that it actually kills the soldiers that bound up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just think of it. Could you imagine? They're bound up. They're inching forward closer and closer to the fire, knowing that they're going to die in a couple of seconds. And then they see the men who were heating up the fire fall in and die themselves. They smell human flesh burning, knowing that, man, that's going to be me soon. I still will choose not to worship another God. I still stand on the Lord. But what we see in verses 24 and 27, they get thrown in, and Nebuchadnezzar makes a crazy observation. He says, hey, nudges his buddy, weren't there 3 men that we threw in there? I see 4 men, unbound. They don't have the bindings. They're just walking around in their cloaks and their clothes, and they're walking. Why are they walking? There's 4 men in this 7 times hot furnace. No one's dying. The fire's not affecting them. What is happening? And so we might get a little confused here. This is where the ancient guest comes in, okay? So this is what is called, I believe, a Christophany. Everyone say Christophany. A Christophany is an appearance or manifestation of the pre-incarnate Christ. And now that's a big word. I'll explain it in a second, which is Jesus before his birth as a human in the Old Testament. So basically, this is Jesus before he came as a baby. He leaves heaven and visits earth in this moment as a type of deliverer who comes down and walks with them in the fire and protects them and shields them from being totally consumed by this flaming hot furnace. So that's what I say a Christophany is. This is an appearance of Christ. Everyone say Christophany. Christophany, okay? Think of the word epiphany. An epiphany is like something is appearing to something. A Christophany, right, is an appearance of Christ. All right? Their life has now been preserved. And as a result of this, there's the king's response at the end, the last few verses. Nebuchadnezzar then praises their God. He says that he is the most high God. And then he promotes them and he turns his heart to God in this moment. It's a dramatic story. It has the threat of death. It has being told, hey, you have to worship my idols, but they refuse to, and they have resilient faith, and they live in the end. But how does this apply to you and I 3,000 years later? I mean, it's about 2,700 years later. How does this apply to us? And I think that the first point that I have to observe of this text is we sometimes skip too far ahead to try and see, okay, Nebuchadnezzar's the bad guy. I'm the good guys, right? I'm Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I need to have a faith like theirs, obviously. I shouldn't compromise. I think the first point that we need to take from this text is that we are all little Nebuchadnezzars. We are all little Nebuchadnezzars. Now that's a fancy word. Try spelling that in a spelling bee. I was homeschooled, so I had to spell that at home, all right? My mom failed me. No, I'm just kidding. When there's a clear bad guy in the Bible, we rush as Christians to find the good guy, to latch ourselves onto them and identify with them, right? When we see David and Goliath, we're like, I want to be like David, without even thinking how we could also somewhat identify with the bad guy in this story. I don't want you to pass up on Nebuchadnezzar because this whole chapter is written from his perspective. We only get the beginning of this whole chapter. He's creating this image. It's about a 90-foot statue that's made of pure gold, and it's magnificent. He has a whole orchestra, a lot of music. Every dictator in history, every bad king or crazy person in history has manipulated the people by playing music and getting them to start chanting what they're doing. One of the things that Nebuchadnezzar did to the Jews and to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is he put them into these re-educating camps. He taught them the Babylonian ways. He made them eat a particular diet, which they refused, actually. And so he was trying to make the Jews look like the Babylonians, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we also see Daniel in the previous chapters, were not willing to compromise. His pride was monstrous. You and I have a pride just like Nebuchadnezzar sometimes. We want to take matters into our own hands. We want to have absolute control over everything in our lives, that we'll do whatever we can to get what we want. We'll make sure that we study the right tests so we could get the highest grades, so that we could apply for this particular school, so that we could get into this particular major, so that you could get into this particular job, and then you can make all the different money and have all the different, things that you want. We try and have absolute sovereignty and control over our lives the same way that Nebuchadnezzar does. But I think there's something here that we don't see based on what happened in the previous chapter when it comes to Nebuchadnezzar. If you go back one chapter, chapter 2, verses 46 through 47, what happens in this chapter is Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he can't interpret this dream, but Daniel can. Daniel interprets it, and basically the dream is saying, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom's going to fall because God's kingdom is going to reign. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, wow, praise you, praise your God. I believe in him, I confess, and he elevates Daniel in the previous chapter. So it looks like Nebuchadnezzar has a conversion, actually. And so look at Daniel chapter 2, verses 46 and 47. It says this. So this is one chapter back from the furnace, okay? Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Daniel interprets the dream. Nebuchadnezzar believes, and he confesses that Daniel's God is the real God. But then just a couple verses later, he builds this golden image and says, everyone has to worship my gods, plural. He does a 180 from worshiping the Lord to worshiping himself and the gods that he's placed in his life. We do the same thing. We have the mountaintop experience. We go to summer camp. We worship the Lord with reckless abandon. We sing all the songs. We listen to the teaching. We get really close to God. We come home. We're on fire. We're reading our Bible every day. We're praying. We go to youth group all the time. We're inviting our friends to church. We're sharing our faith. We're on fire for the Lord. And then 2 weeks later, we get back from summer camp and we go right back to our old sinful ways. It's foolish how Nebuchadnezzar just said that God is the Lord and then creates this idol. Well, we do the same thing. We say, God, you are Lord, and then we return back to our sin like a dog returning to his vomit. We are just like Nebuchadnezzar sometimes in this story. But what you actually see at the end of chapter 3 is Nebuchadnezzar does it again. He praises the Lord saying, hey, you know what? If your God can protect you from this fiery furnace, then I'm going to believe in him. No one should worship anybody else but their God. And so even though Nebuchadnezzar was this crazy, evil tyrant who was seeking to kill and destroy God's people, God still offers him another opportunity to worship him. There is still grace that is offered to this tyrant, Nebuchadnezzar. And so you and I, though we are little Nebuchadnezzars, and we constantly do a 180 saying, God, I love you, God, I don't. God, I love you, God, I don't. He is still offering forgiveness and salvation and grace to those who turn to him the way that Nebuchadnezzar does. So that's the first point that I want you to see. We all are kind of like Nebuchadnezzars in our own sort of way. The next one is this. We must have an uncompromising faith. We must have an uncompromising faith. Now, this whole story is about faith. It's about the incredible faith of these young Jewish boys where they had multiple chances to deny God, right? They could have bowed down. What's crazy about this story is we see that only 3 people stood up. That means there were a lot of other Jews who were bowing down to this golden image. How sad is that? They compromised. Many Jews were afraid. They didn't want to be thrown into a furnace. They didn't want to die. So they were like, you know what? I'll just worship my God and his gods, plural. No, the Lord demands only worship him alone. There are no other gods before him. That's the first commandment. They were accused in this story. They were snitched on. They were brought before the king. They were bound against their will. They saw the king's own men burning and they smelt their burning flesh. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine being the next one in line to be thrown into the furnace? We don't have a faith like this in America. Some people do. I'm not discrediting your faith or my faith or those who we know, but I feel like a lot of Christians, popular Christianity isn't really that biblical, but biblical Christianity isn't really that popular. And so at times we compromise in our faith. We don't see a strong faith like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego in 2025. When conflict comes before us, we tend to compromise of like, okay, I just want to fit in with the crowd. I don't want to have to change my life in order to stand out. I don't want to stand out of the crowd. I want to look just like other people. Well, there's parts of our world where Christianity is illegal and they can't worship the Lord, like I said earlier. Just this past week, 70 of our own Christian brothers and sisters in the Democratic Republic of Congo were beheaded by ISIS members, people in Islam, right? Who hate Christ, who hate Jesus. But they were unwilling to compromise in their faith. They were not willing to say Allah is Lord, but Yahweh is Lord. And so this is something that still goes on today. They probably knew Daniel chapter 3. They probably were the ones who said, but Lord, even if you don't save us, I will not choose to worship another God before you because you are the great and almighty God whom I worship. Now, we don't face persecution the way that our brothers and sisters do in Africa and in Asia and in the Middle East, but there may be one day that we do. Maybe one of you in here might be called to go to those distant places and go reach the unreached. Go reach those who don't even know Christ. I have friends there. I have friends in North Africa. I have friends in Cambodia who are full-time missionaries trying to get the gospel to people, even though they know that they can be killed the next day. We should have an uncompromising faith, the but if not faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have. Are you going to have a faith like this at Summit? Or is this just going to be a continual youth group you go to have fun on a Sunday night instead of doing homework? Are you going to have an uncompromising, unwavering, rock-solid faith the way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did? Lastly, I think this point of this fourth man in the fire, it teaches us that Christ is with us in our suffering. Christ is with us in our suffering. It says they saw the fourth man walking with them in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar says this, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. I love that detail. They're unbound. They're free. They don't have these chains on them anymore. They don't have these wrappings on them anymore. They're free, and they're with Christ in the middle of the fire. If someone tries to convince you that Jesus is not with you in your suffering, you point them to this passage and say, this was as low as it could have gotten. They were unwilling to compromise, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fire, and they weren't even touched by the fire. It didn't even burn them a little bit. They didn't even smell like smoke. It should have consumed them very quickly. They should have died within seconds. But Nebuchadnezzar looks in, and he sees there's a fourth one in there who's protecting them. He's preserving their life. He walks with them in their suffering. You and I, we're going to deal with suffering in our life. But there's going to be another one in the fire with us who walks with us. Psalm 23:4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For the Lord guides me. He is my shepherd. He protects me with his staff and his rod. And what's crazy about this passage is there's actually a prophecy, something that predicted this passage. In Isaiah 43 verse 2, it says this, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. Now, we're not literally going to be thrown into the fire. But there are times in our life where it may feel like it. Where we feel like, I don't want to live anymore. I'm suffering too much. I don't want to experience this anymore. My heart is broken. This person has betrayed me. I can't believe in marriage anymore because it didn't work for my family. I got there for a bit. When my parents divorced, I felt like I was in the fire. But you know who was with me? Christ was with me the whole time. And he sent me to church. He sent me my friends, right? It wasn't just Christ. Yes, it was Christ, but it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Who are your other friends who are going to walk with you in the fire, no matter how hard life gets? This text shows us that God is with his suffering people. The Jews have been going through so much for so many years. That's literally what the whole Old Testament is about. Literally, the name Israel means one who contends or fights with or wrestles with God. And the whole Old Testament is God wrestling with Israel, trying to rescue them from all the stuff that they get themselves into. But I think that this text shows us about the gospel. The God who can't suffer. He's eternal, he is immortal, he's invisible, he's the only God, right? He's unable to suffer. He actually chooses to come down so that he could suffer for us by becoming man. Not just in this moment where he visits, but he comes down and he enters this world as a baby. And he identifies and lives a life just like you and I as a kid. And he grows up and he lives a perfect life. He never once sins. He walks this earth. He performs many miracles. He preaches many great sermons. He heals the sick. He raises the dead. And then he himself then gets crucified on a criminal's cross. And the weight of the world, the sins of the whole world are laid upon him in that moment. He enters the true furnace where the wrath of God is now placed on him. And he endures being turned on from his own father. He was killed that day, but the wrath of God was poured out on him, and forgiveness was accomplished through his bloodshed. And you and I can be forgiven. That is the reality of the gospel. He became man and suffered for us and entered that real furnace so that you and I don't have to. He saves us from the eternal fire, not just the fire that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced, but he suffered so that we wouldn't have to face eternity apart from him. Christ doesn't just work in our suffering, but he works through our suffering. Now, we may leave this world or we may leave this room and we may be somebody who has a lot of scars and we've been through a lot of emotional baggage and a lot of things that we may have gone through in our life, but Christ can now work through that suffering because he is a God of redemption and forgiveness and new life and new beginnings. You can become a new person here tonight. And many of you may have already been made new, but you look back at your scars and now you could see how God was working in that moment. Because even though they may not have saw it in the moment, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not willing to compromise. He is the one who ultimately suffered so that we can be forgiven. And he rose from the dead. And he ascended, and right now he's in heaven waiting for you and I. He's preparing a place for you and I. All you and I have to do is turn to him in faith and repentance, to believe in him and to trust in that sacrifice that he did on the cross. and the forgiveness of sins will be applied to you, and you will spend eternity with him in heaven.